My name is Hannah Bellamy, or it was Bellamy, the morning I stepped down off the train, and it has been Crane for 41 years since, and I could not hear the whistle that carried me into the Montana Territory, nor the wind that near took my bonnet on the platform, nor the low, careful voice of the man I had crossed 1,000 miles to marry when at last he stood in front of me and said my name. I want to set that down plainly at the start, the way I could not set it down in any of the letters. Because I had been deaf since I was 9 years old, since the scarlet fever came through our farmhouse in Illinois one black winter and took both my brothers into the frozen ground and took the whole world of sound out of my ears along with them, and left me living inside a silence so complete that I have long since forgotten if I ever truly knew what a meadowlark is supposed to sound like, or rain on a roof. I learned to read the shapes of words off of people's lips the way another girl learns her letters, patient and slow, and then all at once. And I learned to make sounds of my own with a mouth that could not hear what it was making, so that my voice came out flat and strange, and too loud in the quiet places, and too soft in the loud ones. And folks in our town had grown used to me, but strangers had not. And I knew, I had always known, that no man was going to choose a wife who could not hear him call her, could not hear the baby cry in the night, could not hear the kettle boil dry, or the wolf at the hen house, or her own husband's voice raised in anger or in love. I was 26 years old in the autumn of 1885, an age at which a woman in my circumstances had stopped being called unmarried and started being called a spinster, and my mother, who had been my ears and my shield for 17 years, had died in the spring of a growth in her side, and I had buried her beside my father and my brothers, and stood in that little plot with the whole living world gone quiet around me, and understood that I was, for the first time, entirely alone in it. There was nothing to keep me in Illinois but 4 graves. And so when the notice came to our county through a marriage agency in St. Louis, a rancher in the Montana Territory wanting a wife, a widower with a small son and a good stretch of land and a house he described in his own hand as too quiet for one man to bear, I wrote back to him, and I told him everything true about myself except the one thing. And I have been ashamed of that leaving out for 41 years, and I have also understood, every one of those years, that if I had written down the truth of my deafness he would never have sent for me, and that some gifts you cannot see any honest way to earn, you can only receive them and spend your life trying to be worthy of the receiving. His letters were short and square and honest. He wrote like a man who had not many words and did not intend to waste the ones he had. His name was Elias Crane, and he told me he was 33 years old, that his wife had died 2 winters gone when a wagon went through the ice of the river crossing and he had pulled her out too late, that his son was 7 and had not spoken a single word since that day, not one, in 2 years, and that he could offer me a sound roof and honest work and his protection and his respect, and that he did not look for love, having buried his, but that he would be a decent man to me all his days. I read that letter until the creases went soft. I do not look for love, but I will be decent to you all my days. It was a colder promise than some, and a warmer one than most, and it was made by a man who had a silent child and did not know that he was writing to a silent woman. And it seemed to me, sitting alone in my dead mother's kitchen, that God, who is not always kind, had for once been almost tender in his arrangement, and that a house holding a boy who would not speak might be the one house in the world with room in it for a woman who could not hear. So I packed my mother's Bible and my good dress and the little I owned into a carpet bag, and I rode the cars 9 days west, and I got off in the wind at a town called Cold Springs, with my heart going like a trapped bird, and I could not hear one sound of the place I had come to live and die in. The wind I knew only by the way it shoved at me. The train I knew only by the shudder that came up through the boards of the platform into the soles of my feet. For I had learned young that the world speaks to the deaf through the ground, through the wood, through the bones. If only you will pay it the kind of attention that hearing folks never learn because they have no need. I stood there with my carpet bag in both hands and I searched the faces on that platform. Because a woman who reads lips reads faces too. Reads the whole body of a person the way you read a page. And I found him before he found me. He was standing apart from the others by a buckboard wagon. A tall, broad man gone still in all that motion, sun-browned and dark-bearded with deep-set eyes the color of creek water over stone, and he was holding a fistful of late purple asters gone wilted in his grip, holding them the awkward way a man holds flowers when he does not know what his hands are for. And half behind his leg, gripping a fold of his coat, was a small boy with sandy hair and a thin white face and eyes that watched me the way a wild thing watches from the edge of a clearing, ready to bolt. I knew them both at once. I walked to them across the boards and I felt every step of it come up through my feet. He took off his hat. His mouth made the shape of my name, Mrs. Bellamy, and I read it off his lips, and I answered him. And I saw the small flinch go across his face at the flatness of my voice, the wrongness of it. Gone in half a breath, but I had spent my life watching for exactly that flinch, and I did not miss it. He did not understand yet what he had heard. He only knew something in it sat strange. He held out the wilted asters, and I took them. And I made myself say thank you, watching his eyes to gauge how the words landed, and he nodded and turned to load my bag, and I stood there holding those brave, sad flowers a dying man's daughter might have picked. And I thought, he does not know, and I am going to have to be the one to break it, and I could not think how. We drove out to the ranch, the three of us on the wagon seat with the boy between us, and Elias Crane talked, the way I have since learned a shy man talks when he is nervous, in bursts, pointing. That ridge there was the edge of his land. That dark line was the river that had taken his wife. The grass had come good this year, and I watched his lips and answered where I could and missed the half of it. The way I always did with a stranger not yet used to facing me square when he spoke, and he took my missing for shyness, and the boy between us said nothing at all, which was the one mercy of that ride, that the child's silence covered mine. Once the wheel dropped in a rut and the boy pitched against my arm, and I felt him go rigid with the fear of having touched me, and I looked down and smiled at him with the whole of my heart, and he did not smile back, but he did not pull away either, and he studied my face with a fierce, still attention that I recognized because it was my own. It was the look of a person who has learned to get their knowing through their eyes because some other door has closed. The house was a good frame house, with a porch and real glass windows, kept clean the plain hard way a man keeps a house, swept but not gentled, a house that had lost the woman who made it warm, and had been holding its breath 2 years. There was a supper Elias had set to keep on the stove, and he served it out shy and apologized for it before I had tasted a bite. And the three of us ate in a quiet that suited me better than any table I had sat at in years. And the boy, whose name was Micah, would not touch his food until he had watched me take the first bite of mine. Afterward, Elias showed me a small room off the kitchen made up fresh with a quilt. And he stood in the doorway, turning his hat in his hands, and his mouth made the words, "You'll want to rest. We'll speak of the arrangement tomorrow. The preacher comes through of a Sunday. There's no hurry on it." And I read it off him, And I nodded, and he left me a whole night of grace before anything would be decided, and I lay down in that borrowed room in the dark, and I wept without a sound, for I have never in my life known how to weep any other way. I meant to tell him in the morning. I truly did. But the morning did not wait for confessions, because the morning brought the thing that told him first, the same as it always seems to in these stories. Only what told Elias Crane was not a cow in trouble. It was the ground itself. I woke deep in the black before dawn, and I woke because I felt it. I lay in that strange bed and I felt through the floorboards, up through the ropes and the straw tick and into my very spine, a drumming, a deep, sick, rolling thunder in the earth that no ear told me of, that my body simply knew, the way my body had learned to know the train and the wind and my mother's step on the stair. And I sat straight up in the dark, and I knew. The way you know a thing in your bones, because it is in fact in your bones, that something very large was moving very fast across that land and moving wrong. I did not stop for a shawl. I ran through the dark house and I felt the vibration grow, and I came out onto the porch into a night lit only by a low sinking moon, and I could see far out on the pale grass a boiling darkness pouring down off the ridge toward us. The whole herd, 400 head and more, run mad and stampeding, and I could not hear the thunder of it, but I did not need to hear it. I could feel it coming up through the porch boards into my bare feet like the end of the world. And it was pointed, near as I could tell in that light, straight at the horse corral and the barn, and past the barn, at the low bunk side of the house where I knew, from Elias having pointed it out with such quiet pride, that his son slept. There was no time to think about my voice being strange. I ran back into the house and I went for Elias's door, and I did not knock. I threw it open, and I took him by the shoulder and shook him hard out of sleep, and when his eyes came open confused and reaching, I did the only thing I could. I pointed out through the wall toward the ridge, and I put his own hand flat on the floorboards so that he could feel what I had felt, and I saw the moment it reached him, the moment his palm caught the drumming, and his face changed from a sleeping man's to a rancher's, who has just understood that his whole living is running straight at his house in the dark. He was up and pulling on his boots before I had stepped back, and he was shouting things I could not hear, and I did not need to hear them. I had already turned for the boy. I got to Micah's little room, and the child was sitting up terrified, feeling it too by then, the whole house beginning to shiver. And I did not waste a breath trying to explain with a voice he had never heard me use. I simply held out both my arms to him in the dark. And that silent boy, who had not let a soul near him in 2 years, looked at the woman he had known for one single day, and he came. He came out of that bed and into my arms and held onto my neck with his whole small strength. And I carried him. I carried him out the far door and away from the barn and up the little rise behind the house where the ground was firm and no cattle would come, and I set him down and I put my body between him and the world, and I felt, rather than saw or heard, the herd hit the ranch below us. I felt the corral rails go. I felt it through the hill under my knees, the terrible passing weight of them, and I held that boy's face against my shoulder so he would not see if any of it turned bad. And I looked for Elias in the murk, and my heart stopped, because I could see him, out ahead of the flood on his night horse that he had somehow got saddled, riding hard along the flank of the run, doing the one desperate thing a man can do, turning the leaders, pushing his horse against the wall of them to bend the whole mass by inches away from the barn and the house and the sleeping child, who was not sleeping now but safe. Safe on the hill in the arms of the deaf woman who had felt them coming a full 2 minutes before any hearing soul in that house would have known. And he turned them. he turned 400 head of maddened cattle in the dark, by the width of his own courage and the speed of a warning he had gotten from a wife he had known for one day. And the flood split and poured down along the river fence and spent itself out on the flats below. And when the gray light came up at last, there were 3 horses hurt and a mile of fence flattened and a water trough smashed to, kindling. But the barn stood, and the house stood, and the boy stood, holding my hand on the top of that little rise, and no soul on that ranch was dead. Elias came up the hill on foot leading his blown and trembling horse, and he was filthy and bleeding from a rail that had caught his arm, and he stopped in front of me in the dawn, and he looked at me, and then he looked at his son standing pressed against my side, with his small hand locked in my ruined voiced hand, and I saw the questions cross his face, one after another. How had I known? How had I woken before the dogs, before him, before the horses even? And I knew the hour I had dreaded had come around, only it had come at the far end of a saved night instead of a lost one. And I let go of the boy, and I made myself stand straight, and I gave Elias Crane the confession I had carried 1,000 miles. My voice came out flat and strange in the dawn, and I did not try to soften it. There was no point any longer. I am deaf, I said, since I was 9 years old, since a fever. I have never heard one word you have spoken to me. I read them off of your lips. I did not hear the herd. I felt it, in the floor, in my bones, the way I have felt every sound of my whole life since the world went quiet, and that is the only reason I woke. And I wrote you the truth of everything but this, because if I had written it, you would never have sent for me. And I know that is a low and cowardly thing, to come all this way behind a lie of leaving out. And I will go back on the Sunday stage, and I will not cost you the fare. But I could not let your boy lie sleeping under that. And I stood there in the cold dawn with the ruin of me finally spoken plain, waiting for the flinch to become a turning away, waiting for the decent man's cold courtesy that would send me home, because I had lied, and a lie unmakes a promise, and I had earned whatever was coming. Elias Crane was quiet a long moment, and I watched his face, because his face was the only voice I would ever have of him, and I saw it move through the whole of it, the shock and the understanding, and something underneath both that I did not dare to name. And then he did a thing I have turned over in my heart every single day of the 41 years since. He did not speak. Not at first. He knew, this man who had lived 2 years with a boy who would not speak, that some things cannot be reached with the voice at all. He stepped close to me, and he lifted both his big scarred hands, and slowly, deliberately, so that I could read it, he touched his fingers to his own ear, and then shook his head, no. And then he laid his open hand flat over his own heart, and pressed it there. And then, watching my eyes the whole time to be sure I caught it, he reached out and laid that same hand flat over mine, over my heart, and held it there, and his mouth made the words, slow and clear and certain, so a deaf woman could not mistake a one of them. I did not send for a pair of ears. I did not send for a woman to hear me. I have been hollering into this house for 2 years, and no soul answered, and last night a woman who has never heard a sound in 17 years felt my whole life coming to kill us in the dark, and got out of her bed and saved my son before I had my eyes open. He held his hand harder against my heart. I do not care that you cannot hear me, he said, and I read every word off his lips in the gray light. I care that you came. I care that when the ground shook you ran toward my boy and not away. The hearing I can do for the both of us. He looked down then at his son, and he did the last thing, the thing that broke me open entirely. He took Micah's small hand, and he laid it too against my chest beside his own, and the 3 of us stood there on that hill, in the dawn joined at my heart, and the silent boy looked up at me with his father's creek water eyes, and his mouth moved. It moved, and it made a sound, the first sound in 2 years, cracked and rusty and barely a whisper, and I could not hear it. Of course I could not hear it, but I did not have to, because I have read lips my whole life, and I read his, and what that child said, the first word he had spoken since the river took his mother, was, "Stay." Just that, stay. And Elias, who could hear it, who had waited 2 years to hear his son's voice again and had just heard it spent on a single word begging a deaf stranger not to leave, made a sound of his own that I felt go through his hand into my chest. And I gathered them both against me, the man and the boy, and I said the only thing there was to say. I said, I will. I will. I am not going anywhere. And I have kept that promise every day of my life. We were married in Cold Springs the following Sunday, and I stood before the preacher and read the service off his lips and made my vows in my flat, strange voice loud and clear for the whole church to hear. Because I was done hiding the sound of myself, and when he came to the part where the bride is meant to answer, I answered so plain and so unashamed that I have been told the women of that town wept to hear it. But I will not pretend the road ran smooth from the church door, for a deafness does not mend for being loved, and there was hardship in it, real hardship, in the learning of how to run a house and a marriage across a silence. There were things I truly could not do. I could not be left with the baby when the babies came, unless someone rigged me away to know it woke. And so Elias ran a length of cord from the cradle to a little bell of stones on my wrist that would shake me from sleep when the child stirred, a thing he invented himself, sitting up nights over it. I could not hear a rider come into the yard, and so I learned to watch the dog, who became my ears, and to feel the hoofbeats in the floor the way I had felt the herd. I could not hear my husband call me from the barn, and so we made our own tongue between us, a whole language of the hands that Elias built up out of nothing, sign by sign, over the years, so that from clear across a field he could tell me supper or trouble, or come quick, or I love you with a shape of his fingers. And our children grew up speaking it as easy as English, thinking every family had a second silent language, and pitying, a little, the families that did not. And what I could do, I did with a fierceness that came from all those years of being counted useless. I could watch. A deaf woman learns to see what hearing folks let slide past, and I saw the lame in a horse 3 days before it went dead lame, and I saw the sick in a calf by the set of its ears before it went off its feed, and I saw, God help me, the things in people's faces that their mouths were busy denying, so that I knew when a hired man was lying about the count, and I knew when a neighbor woman's cheer was hiding a bruise. And Cold Springs learned across the years to bring its silences to me, its troubles that could not be said out loud, because the deaf wife of Elias Crane could read a face like Scripture and would never once repeat what she read. And I could reach the boy. That was the thing I am proudest of in the whole of my life. Micah came back to us word by word across that first year. First the whispers, then the questions, then one blessed spring evening the laughter, real and loud, and I felt it shake his little chest where he was leaned against me, and Elias and I looked at each other over the sound of our son laughing, a sound I could not hear, and he could, and neither of us could have said a word just then if the ranch had been afire. There was a woman in Cold Springs, a Mrs. Farley, who kept the mercantile and kept, besides, the tally of everybody's failings, and she said in the store where she made sure I could see her say it, mouthing it slow and cruel, that Elias Crane had married a deaf mute who would let his children drown for want of hearing them cry, and I read every word off her hard mouth. and finished my order in my flat, unbothered voice and walked out with my spine straight and cried the 9 miles home where no one could see. But 2 winters on, Mrs. Farley's own girl fell through the mill pond ice at the edge of town, and it was market Saturday, and the whole street was loud with wagons and hawkers, and the child went in without a splash anyone caught over the din, and it was me standing across the way. Me who was not fooled by the noise, because I have never once been fooled by noise. Me who saw the ripple wrong and the small dark shape under the skin of the ice, while 100 hearing souls stood in the racket and saw nothing. And I ran, and I went in after her, and I brought that girl out blue and limp, and got the water out of her on the frozen bank, and gave Mrs. Farley back her daughter. She never did say she was sorry, but she came to me at the church door the next Sunday and took both my hands in both of hers and formed the words with great care, slow, so the deaf woman would be sure to catch them. Thank you. And I read them, and I nodded, and after that there was not a door in that county closed to me. And I want to set down, too, the ordinary tenderness of it, because the saving of children and the turning of herds make a fine tale, but they are not the marrow of a life. The marrow was the small things. It was Elias learning to face me always when he spoke, even in the dark, even angry, even half asleep, so I would never miss his words. It was the way he took to touching my shoulder before he came up behind me, always, every time. So I who could hear nothing learned to feel him coming the way the ground feels the rain. It was the winter evening he came in from the barn with a thing he had whittled through a month of nights, a little wooden bird on a stand with a wheel inside it that a child could set to spinning, and it did not make music. For what use would music be to me? It made a soft, steady drumming through the table into my hands, and he set it before me shy as a boy and would not meet my eye, and it was, I understood, a thing he had made so that I could feel a kind of song. And I have that bird yet, worn smooth 40 years of evenings in it. A man who does not look for love will show it in the shape of a wooden bird that drums, long before he can say it in the shape of a word. That was near 40 years ago. I am an old woman now, writing this by a good lamp in the same frame house, and I am deaf still. I was always going to be deaf still. That part of me never mended and never was going to. Elias Crane sleeps out under the prairie asters in the Cold Springs ground these 4 years, and I go and sit with him. And I am not so sad as you might think, for we were given 41 years neither of us was ever promised. And out of them came Micah, grown to a fine talking man with children of his own, and 3 more after him. And a ranch that a grieving widower could not hold alone now runs beyond 1,000 head under our sons. And it was held, all of it, all those years, by a woman who could not hear a single word of it, and a boy who would not speak, and a man who learned to talk with his hands. I have thought a great deal, in my old age, about that night the ground shook, about the lie I carried 1,000 miles, and the confession I dreaded, and the certainty I bore like a stone that my silence was the whole of what a man would ever see when he looked at me. I was so sure I was arriving as less than a woman, a burden dressed up as a bride. And a tall, shy man laid my own hand over his heart and told me the silence was never what he'd married. And a boy who had not spoken in 2 years spent his first word begging me to stay. And I learned the thing I would give the world to go back and tell the frightened woman on that windy platform, which is that the places where we are broken are not the places where we are less. They are only the places where we are made to pay a deeper attention, and out of that attention comes a knowing that the whole and the hearing never have to learn, and never do. I could not hear my own children laugh, But I felt 400 head of ruin coming in the dark 2 minutes before any hearing soul on that ranch, and I saw a drowning child under the ice while a whole town stood deaf in its own noise. And I loved a grieving man and a wordless boy back into the land of the living. And if that is what a deaf woman can do, then I will take my silence, and I will thank God for the fever that took my hearing, because the same quiet that closed the world's noise to me opened the world's trembling ground, and it was because I felt them coming that a boy is alive who called me mother. He is out there under the asters. I will lie down beside him soon enough. And I am not afraid of it, for I have spent my whole life in the quiet, and I have found it is not empty. It was never empty. It was only waiting for me to learn the other way of listening. You come to the door with your worst held out before you, certain it is the end of you. And a good soul takes it up in both hands and lays it against his heart and tells you it was never the bargain at all. It was always only the heart that was willing to make the journey and to run the right way in the dark. And mine had come 1,000 miles through a country it could not hear, and it had run when the ground shook, toward the child and not away, and that in the end was the whole of what he ever asked of me, and it was home.